We'll go ahead and start. There's a card in, should be an index card for everybody. Since we're going to be talking about the history of liturgy, I thought I would let you reflect for a minute on what liturgy is.
It's not really fair because what the people in the seminary.
Well, yeah, I was Unitarian Universalist. We didn't do liturgy.
Okay.
She turned it over.
Yeah. My Methodist colleagues got a big dose of it.
Okay.
I just know the joke.
And feel free to elaborate, those of you that are such quick wits there, feel free to elaborate on the difference if you feel that there is any.
I was proud I just put 2 words. You want me to do more than that?
Feel free to elaborate on what you might think is the difference between liturgy and worship.
That is the tiniest writing I've ever seen.
This is a peek. Do you want to ruin the cheating?
It's not a
It's
test,
not a
Debbie,
test.
because we're going to talk about it. I just felt like if you had a chance to think about it and write it down, that it would invite conversation. I'm so sorry.
She loses the
Multitasking?
Are you finished, Mr. Whittemore?
maybe.
Okay.
We draw
All right.
back.
So, your thoughts. What is liturgy? We don't have to. We can go.
I said religious traditions includes congregation participation.
Okay.
I said the use of Bible readings, prayers, and confessions of the church within worship.
Okay.
Now the answer. Well, what I learned, liturgy is the work of the people.
Oh.
Yeah. And a system of symbolic actions, rituals, etc., created to enhance worship.
Okay.
Sounds very professorial.
Yes, sir.
I'm in that mode.
I was a professor and I never said things like that.
Do you have anything you want to add?
I don't think of myself as a liturgical, or I come from a liturgical background. Baptists I don't consider to be liturgical. Is that right? Did you say that?
What did you say?
Baptists aren't generally understood to be liturgical.
Oh,
And
Baptist.
I gotta agree.
This church here, we do it all the time, every Sunday.
Well,
Now, with
Not
your
as much.
definition, Baptist
Make a
would be.
statement of who you
But they
are.
don't claim to be.
But
Actually,
they are.
this Unitarian Universalists deny that they are
Yeah,
having any liturgy at all,
And
which just
see-
makes me snicker.
Baptists do too.
Right. But if you look at the order of service, you have to laugh at that
Yeah.
because there is liturgy. The order of service is a liturgical pattern. So what we're going to talk about in the next 5 weeks are the patterns of worship, which become liturgy. And we're also going to talk, if we're going to talk about the history of liturgy, we have to go back to the very beginning of Christianity, which we have to go back further and go into the Old Testament to see what they were doing, which is the way Jesus worshiped when he was growing up. So tonight we're going to focus on Old Testament practices and what Jesus practiced as liturgy when he was alive, and how that all got transformed at the Lord's Supper. And that's basically the premise of what we're going to do tonight. And I've used a lot of information from a book called A History of the Liturgy by Marcel Metzger. It's hard to find information about the early church without there being a lot of leaning toward it being the Catholic Church. Well, why? Because that's what it was. The first 4 centuries led up to the beginning of the Catholic Church, and then heaven only knows how long. Oh, until the Reformation, when other factions began to come about, the Protestant Church. So I'm going to read some things from various scriptures to let you know how the early Hebrews, Jewish people, practiced their liturgy. And apparently God was very specific about what was going to happen when they worshiped. First of all, he sent Moses to a burning bush. And in Exodus 3:12, along with some other things that he told him, he specifically said, I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you, that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. Well, Moses had 1,000 questions after that, and we're not going to talk about those tonight, but that's where it all started, right there. And this is why I needed this. He told them to build a tabernacle. All right, so what is the difference between my writing gets worse and worse as I get older and older. We hear these words interchanged. But what is the difference between a tabernacle, a synagogue, a temple, and a church?
For one thing, you put them in order. Well, maybe synagogue and temple would be the opposite order. But the tabernacle definitely came first. That was the temporary
Right.
of God.
Did you know this? That a tabernacle, the first tabernacle was a tent. Okay? First tabernacle was a tent. And that's where the what was kept?
Ark of the Covenant.
Ark of the Covenant. And I think of Indiana Jones every time I think Ark of the Covenant, a tent. It was in the desert. It was transportable. So when the people had to move, they took this all with them. And when was the first temple built?
Solomon's.
Yes, David had the idea, but it was not until Solomon came along.
Oops, one down.
Next.
Oh, sorry, thank you. It was not until Solomon came along that we have the first permanent temple.
That's about 1000 BCE, right?
Mm-hmm.
Somewhere around there.
Yeah. So then what's with a synagogue? What's a synagogue then?
There were multiple synagogues, and they were spread out over the area where people lived. And the people reserved coming to the temple for very special occasions,
Exactly.
feasts and pilgrimages and such. Because for most people, it was quite a travel challenge to come to the temple, which was in Jerusalem. But synagogues could be out in the neighborhoods and villages and towns where people lived.
Were they buildings or just gathering?
Yeah.
The synagogue was a building.
Yeah, because there was a temple, and that's actually the ark was in the temple. So
It had a permanent home.
a stone tabernacle, so to speak.
Permanent home, yes.
And the early synagogues were kind of like Jewish community centers. And they sort of stayed that way until after the destruction of the temple. And then it's like, what do we do now? And they started moving into the synagogues.
The synagogues became much more important when there was no temple to supplement them.
Yes. This is where the people were taught. This is where they gathered. Yes.
He's teaching.
And this is where they began to have rabbis who were the teachers. Jesus taught in the synagogue. He's mentioned several times in the New Testament going to the synagogue to teach. Okay, and now the last one, church.
Didn't those begin in homes? Like in Paul's time?
Yes, this is a New Testament word, which means basically the same thing as the synagogues, except that they're under the new covenant.
They were the synagogues for Christians.
Right.
Jesus followed.
Yes. And they were, in the first century, these words were pretty much synonymous, but you rarely see the word synagogue in Christian documents after the first century. So just wanted to clarify that. I think this was pretty much new information for me when I was in grad school. It's like, because I know there is a temple in Atlanta. Because I had a Jewish friend who went to the temple. And the temple was bombed, remember, now, in the 60s.
You dropping Miss Daisy.
Yes. So, and there was a Tabernacle Baptist Church in Atlanta. Now it's a rock band
Well,
venue.
the Catholic Church has special churches as well as those that aren't. They got names for them. I forgot the names. But like in Atlanta, there's one church that's Catholic, and it's a special, has a name that's different
The
than the others.
cathedral.
Cathedral, that's right. Cathedral.
Real big churches.
You do certain things there you don't do in other churches.
The Episcopalians have the same thing. They
Yes.
have the cathedral in Atlanta.
St.
And-
Philip's.
St. Philip's, but most of the others are just called churches or parishes.
Now, I'm not going to take the time tonight to read it all, but you might want to make a note of Exodus 25 if you want to know exactly what God told them to do for the tabernacle. It's all laid out in Exodus 25. And boy, he wanted some expensive things. And he said, if you do
For the temple?
And for the tabernacle.
for the tabernacle,
The original.
yeah, and it goes on into 26 also. Oh, it's just elaborate, very elaborate,
Very
and
specific too.
yes,
Like the measurements for each implement are
yes.
specified.
And it was, so it's you can imagine these people who did all of this and put it all together, how devastated they were when their temple or their tabernacle was devastated. And then when the temple was also ravaged and destroyed.
Isn't in one of the Psalms it says even the dust of the temple or whatever brings the people to tears, or there's something like that. I'm trying to
I'm not familiar with that song,
I'm
but
probably-
I always like the poetic phrase that actually the inner sanctum of the temple was where the hem of God's garment touched the earth.
Oh.
Oh,
A direct connection.
wow.
I remember during the exile, when there had been foreign invaders came into Judah. And I don't know that they completely destroyed the temple, but I know that they tore down the walls of Jerusalem so that it was no longer protected, and the temple was at least ravaged. Like sacred implements were taken out, and maybe it was damaged. And how, when the people who were the residents of Jerusalem were taken out of Jerusalem and put in exile in Babylon, how cut off they felt from their religion, because their understanding of God at that time was a very physical presence, and God's presence was back there in that damaged, ravaged temple, and they felt cut off. So one of the things that the priests and scribes did during the exile was to create a more present sense of God's presence with them, even though they were physically separated from that temple. And that had not been necessary before until the time of the exile.
And yet that's very interesting in that they only visited there once a year. Once a year. They had that deep connection to this physical presence.
The Holy of Holies
Yeah.
was only in one place.
Yep.
Literally.
Because he promised that if this was built for him, he would be there. Very interesting. So the first acts of liturgy were sacrificial offerings. You see evidence of it in Exodus and Leviticus. And in Leviticus, we find that the people were not involved in this process at all. It was only the priest who could offer the sacrifices, and they were done in the name of the people. And this practice continued all the way up through Zechariah. Now, who was Zechariah? Anybody know? You cannot answer?
There was a great movie called Zachariah. It's a Western.
Anybody know?
Well, it was a prophet, wasn't
I
it?
should have
A minor prophet.
Well, I'm thinking with other
the father.
Oh, you're thinking of Zechariah.
Oh,
Yes,
That was the
father of
John the Baptist.
John the Baptist. Yeah.
That's
Okay.
Zachariah.
So now we're right on up
I
to
was Zechariah.
yeah, 100 years.
Zacchaeus.
Not Zacchaeus. Wee little man and a wee little man was he. Sorry. So this was this continued through 4,000 years, 3,000 or 4,000 years, 2,000 years. Historian, help me out.
1,000 years.
1,000 years. Okay. But it was not to continue for very long after that. The choice parts of the animal were burned in the sacrifice. It was not until the Last Supper that sacrificial offering was stopped. Now, I have not been able to determine in Jewish history if they actually stopped sacrificing, at what point they actually stopped sacrificing animals. I looked for that information. I did not find it.
Well, they were still sacrificing lambs at the Passover when Jesus died.
But beyond that,
Oh, you mean how long they might have kept doing it? Well, the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, so 40 years after Jesus died.
okay,
The temple was no more, so they couldn't offer sacrifices
Okay.
there anymore.
all right. I didn't think it was too much after that. Now, this had been prophesied in Isaiah 55 and Proverbs 9. in Proverbs 9, come eat of my bread and drink of the wine I have mixed. Lay aside immaturity and live and walk in the light of insight. She has slaughtered her animals. She has mixed her wine. She's also set her table. They took that as a foresight of, we're not going to do that anymore after wisdom comes. And then Isaiah 55. It's a long chapter, and I wasn't going to read the whole thing to you. So I have to find it. Give me a minute. Well, the covenant shall be extended to all who obey. And there are other references in that chapter that suggest that we no longer need to sacrifice, that it is open to the people. And so that was the interpretation, that Jesus was the true bread, and the new covenant replaced sacrificial worship.
Can I add something that just came to my mind?
Sure.
I'd never thought about it before, but I think the tradition of sacrifices in the Jewish tradition was that the priests were the only one who could eat of the sacrifices.
That's right.
The sacrifices weren't then given to the people to enjoy. But with the Last Supper, Jesus served the people.
Exactly right. Yes, and that was
Big
coming up. Yes, it is a big difference. With the Eucharist, or with the Lord's Supper, the table is open to the people. It's a big moment.
It's still argued about too.
Yeah.
Fifth table, open table.
Who can partake?
Yeah. But with that, they also appropriated the morning and evening offices of reading, blessings, prayers, and those were all done in the synagogues at the time. So next week, we're going to spend some time looking at something called the Clementine documents. And you'll see that even in the first worship services of the Christians, there are words that Teresa uses every Sunday morning. And these were recorded. A lot of this was just word of mouth because they had to be so secretive back then. But there are some things that were written down. And I went, wow, Teresa says that every Sunday. Isn't that cool? So in Hebrews 7:26 and 27, for it was fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, blameless, undefiled, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. Unlike the other high priest, he has no need to offer sacrifices day after day for his own sins and then for those of the people. This he did once for all when he offered himself. So that was their justification for not sacrificing. The ultimate sacrifice had been made. The Eucharist becomes the pre-Christian Sunday liturgy. So when they met every Sunday, they had the Eucharist every Sunday. And basically that was the body of their worship service.
Mass.
That was the Mass.
So that was what you said, the liturgy of the early Christians?
Yes. They were trying to do what Jesus told them to do. He said, take this bread, take this wine, do this in remembrance of me. And so they did it at every worship service. Now, they had other things that they did during the week. See, they appropriated all of these Jewish blessings and the teachings, and they went back and read scriptures. And apparently there was already established a daily liturgy of the hours. In other words, at this time of day, we're going to read this psalm, or we're going to repeat. Well, they didn't read it. They repeated this psalm, or we're going to say this blessing at this time of day. And then the Eucharist will be done at this time of day, every day. And their whole reason for doing this, that the liturgy was mystery. And that mystery was, how do I find God? How do I pursue this so deeply that I find God? And that was the essence of what their worship was.
So it's almost like the liturgy acted as a spiritual door for
Right.
them to
Right.
open and commune with God.
Right. Worship was their goal, and the goal was to communicate with God.
Were these things that they did every day, were those already based on previous Jewish traditions?
Jewish
Okay.
tradition. And then when in the third session, when we talk about the Catholic traditions, the true Mass, like in a monastery, the monastery is based on 2 hours. They worship every 2 hours. And that is so close to what the Jewish tradition was. They just kind of slipped right into it.
Did the Jews ever have anything that was comparable to a monastery?
I don't
Jews?
know. I don't know.
I know the Essenes were a Jewish community, but I've never heard anybody say that they were anything like a monastery, that they were cloistered.
Well, they did cloister, though. They did go away from,
Yeah, separate themselves.
they separated
somewhat.
themselves.
That's
And-
the solid side. They were not it's not your average Jewish person.
Right. Well, a resident in a monastery is not your average Christian person either.
Right.
Were the Essenes part of the Desert Fathers that we
No, the Essenes was a Jewish community in the first century, and the Desert Fathers came in later centuries, and they were Christian communities.
That'd be interesting to delve into. The new liturgy, the liturgy of the new covenant included rites, prayers, meditation, reflection. And in doing these, they were training the soul for every virtue. It would be hard not to be a good person if you did all of these things. And I was thinking about that when I was reading all of these prayers in this Clementine document. We come for 45 minutes on Sunday morning, as opposed to every 2 hours every day of the week.
How did they have time to do anything else? They haven't held in a job.
Well, Muslims today, devout Muslims, take time out of their day to hear the call to prayer and to put out their prayer rugs and put their heads down. And it doesn't last long,
Right.
but they take breaks during the day. And if you've been to the Middle East, you can't miss the calls to prayer from the mosques. And
Right.
yeah, they let people know, if you're not watching your watch, it's time to stop your work and
put down your prayer rug and pray.
I worked with a Muslim woman at my last job, the one I retired from finally. And she would simply just disappear. She was a teacher, but she had someone else cover her class 3 times a day during the school day. And she went and prayed. And when she came back, I kid you not, she had a glow about her. Like, all's well with the world.
We've heard that meditation is very good for us physically and mentally, and I've heard that 20 minutes of meditation is better than an hour of sleep, that it's healthful to our bodies. So maybe we're missing out by not taking time 2 times a day or 3 times a day to stop what we're doing and fall on our faces and just pray.
Yeah. Well, just makes sense, doesn't it? Just let it fall off. Let all the tension fall off. The term liturgy really did not come into general use until about the early 1800s. Before that, the terms were rites and ceremonies, offices. Now, we'll talk more about offices once we get to the Catholic. And then there was the big renewal of the Catholic Church in the mid-20th century, when they went from everything being in Latin to speaking English, and it totally changed.
We were supposed to do that. Officiate weddings. It's an office.
What?
You officiate a wedding.
Officiate related to office.
Something that I found interesting as I was rereading some of my notes from grad school and then reading Metzger's book, thinking about how is the Lord's Supper and communion alike or different. In other words, the original Lord's Supper, the first Lord's Supper. Okay, let's put ourselves at the table with Jesus.
They probably had a variety, wouldn't you think? If it was a meal, fruit, bread.
And by the way, there is some controversy about whether or not it was a Seder meal. I never questioned it before, but I've hit upon that in doing my research for this class.
Because it was on the eve of Passover, when the Seder would traditionally have been taking place.
Yeah. I like to think of it as a Seder meal.
The way I think of it is they had finished their meal, and then Jesus did this like follow-up, symbolic, but I don't know. I don't know if that's the way it happened or not.
Isn't that the way it's presented in some of the Gospels?
See, John doesn't have a Last Supper, a Lord's Supper. In John, they have finished the meal and Jesus stands up and wraps the towel around his waist and does the foot washing. So the other 3 Gospels have the Last Supper on that last night before he was arrested. And John omits that and has the foot washing, which the other Gospels don't have.
And we're going to hopefully do both during Lent.
We've done that before, haven't we?
It's probably been a while. I don't know
long
how
time.
long.
The foot washing? Not since I've been here. I've done it in another church. I've never done
When
it
did you
here.
come?
2017.
Yeah, way before that.
Well, I think of it as Jesus just took the bread and he took the cup and he explained what he wanted people to do in remembrance of him. When we take communion, Teresa offers it to everyone in the congregation. We come up and take it. I'm not sure that the disciples came and took it from Jesus. We don't know.
Passed it,
He might have.
the way the Baptists did it.
Pass it around.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus says, the one who dips his bread in the cup with me. Did you, when he was talking about Judas? It's almost like they had a common cup, but they all had bread.
Yeah.
But we don't know the specifics.
Mm-mm. Oh, and there's so many things that come after this that we don't know anything about. And even some of the bishops of the early church go, well, how did we end up doing this? The sign of the cross. Where did that come from? Why do we do that? It's not written down. And they question all along.
How the traditions came about.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the Catholics go in one direction and the Orthodox go in the other.
Oh,
Right.
I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know which way I do it.
Do you go east to west or west to east?
I think Catholic is up, down, right, left, but I think the Orthodox are up, down, left, right.
My ancestors must have been Catholic because it's natural for me to go.
Well, we've seen it a lot on TV.
Yeah.
And in basketball games.
So Metzger says there are 5 stages of liturgical development. And the first stage is the apostolic, which is first century. And I've got something to read out of the Bible here. Acts 1. '21, 22. It's okay. So one of the men who have accompanied us during all the time that the Lord Jesus went in and out among us, beginning from the baptism of John until the day when he was taken up from us, one of these must have become a witness with us to his resurrection. So they proposed 2, Joseph called Barsabbas, who was also known as Justus, and Matthias. Then they prayed and said, Lord, am I on the right? Yeah. They prayed and said, Lord, you know everyone's heart. Show us which one of these 2 you have chosen to take the place in this ministry and apostleship from which Judas turned aside to go to his own place. And they cast lots for them, and the lot fell on Matthias, and he was added to the 11 apostles. I think I've got the wrong thing.
And we don't cast lots today
We will die.
to replace our elders.
That might be easier. I could just be on the nominating. I like that.
In the early times, the churches had no public status. And in fact, it was pretty rough. You had to hide in the early traditions. So you're right. A lot of them met in houses. And they were communities or small, very little regional diversification. And as they grew, then they just kept expanding, and then they became public, and then they became part of the state. And that's when we have the Roman Catholic Church. and there was conversion of people as a result of the conversion of the leaders of state, you will become a Catholic because
State religion.
well, and we have one of those countries that's still like that today.
Just one.
Anybody know? That if you live there, you have to be a member of their church? No, a whole country.
Well, the Vatican is a whole country.
Oh, is it? I didn't know that. Sweden.
Really?
Is what?
Sweden.
Oh,
So what's their church?
Yeah.
Is it the Church of Sweden? I don't know.
No, it's Lutheran.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. All right. Basil the Great wrote a lot of things, and he left us some good documentation about the development of the church. The catechumens are, what are the catechumens?
They're the students who are ready to become members of the church. They're candidates for membership or candidates for baptism.
And yet it wasn't very nice of the church to exclude them from participating in the Eucharist while they were catechumens. They got to a certain point in the worship service and they all turned their backs on the catechumens and said, "Bye, you have to leave now." And they had to leave.
was it in the 1980s, or when was it when we started extending participation in communion to children?
I don't know.
That hasn't been that long, though.
Really?
Really? I don't know.
Well, we raised Baptists, we weren't allowed to take communion
Until
unless
we
we
were
had been
baptized.
Yeah, after we were baptized, right. So Basil's the one that questioned all of these things, like the sign of the cross, and you were supposed to pray to the east.
Oh,
Bet you didn't know that.
I didn't.
Our graves are faced that way. So you face the east.
Oh, the graves are?
Traditional, all graves face east.
I didn't know.
So when the sun came up, it's
I've heard that. When I drive by a cemetery, I always look, all right, what direction are they going? And you will find them. There's one I know on that road from Athens to Conyers, 78. There's one. They're all facing east. It's just interesting.
Well, and Barry's real interested in why cemeteries in this area all have rocks on the graves, tiny, almost pebbly rocks. Lots of cemeteries, including where my great-grandparents and my grandparents are buried.
It's down the weeds.
I never saw that when we moved down here.
Oh,
Any of the other place I've ever lived.
I don't know if that's the reason. But
Yeah, it's just like, because they're usually like an older border,
yeah.
and then sometimes white gravel over it. And I keep asking her, like, what's that? Where did this come from? Why don't you write a paper on it?
There's probably some physical explanation, but I don't know. I know they would cover, like in the 1700s, they would cover graves with rocks to keep the wild animals from digging up
Right.
the bodies. So
But
maybe
those
it
are
just,
bigger rocks.
Yes, so maybe it just became a tradition to cover a grave with rocks.
I wanted to read you one more passage. For I received from the Lord what I also handed on to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took a loaf of bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body that is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, he took the cup also after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Now that's word for word what you say. That's right straight out of the scripture. And this is in 1 Corinthians. Paul is sort of sort of using that to say, do not have homes to eat and drink in, or do you show contempt for the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What should I say to you? Should I commend you in this manner? I do not commend you. He's talking about churches that are having the Lord's Supper and not doing it right. So they were very strict about what they wanted people to do, even in the early stages of developing there.
Some of this, we would get together for a common meal, but it wasn't a potluck. It was like bring your own. And so rich people were sitting there, gorging themselves, all kinds of good stuff, while the poor people had hardly anything. Like, this is not the way to do it. It's always thought the perfect communion would be a potluck.
And everybody shares
And
what everybody has.
And the doors are open. But that's me.
There were baptisms. That is a rite, and they were performed early on and became a significant part of becoming a part of the church. Now, I don't know at what point it became, I'm going to just tap you on the head with water, as opposed to John dipping you in the river. But that happened pretty early on.
I don't know at what time they started baptizing infants, because I don't think they did that in the first century. I don't think there's any evidence of it.
No. And we won't know that because they didn't document it. There are some secret and mystical traditions that we will never know about because they were never written down. It was all done by oral tradition. And there is a reverence for the mystery. And in the Catholic Church, there's even more mystery than in Protestant denominations. And I think we got a taste of that when they started writing books, Angels and Demons, and you get little snippets of the mystery. During the early church, as they spread out, these liturgies developed in parallel form, primarily because there were people who traveled from church to church to church. And luckily for us, there were people who wrote things down. Justin, Irenaeus, and because Greek was the common language, they all wrote in the same language. For example, it was not common practice to speak in Latin until the Roman Catholic Church took it over. But by that time, the Kyrie eleison was so well established that they wouldn't give it up. And so in the Catholic Mass, they still sang Kyrie eleison, Christe, which is Greek. It's Greek, yeah. But the rest of the Mass is in Latin. And we sing it, Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy, which is what it means. We sing it in English. The other evidence we have is archaeological. Building layouts, we have evidence of where the things were in the buildings, and monuments, paintings, mosaics, and sculptures. And we found those in Syria, Ravenna, Rome, and North Africa. So that was the heartland of the birth of Christianity.
And so even like in North Africa and Syria, they would be doing similar practices even in the different countries?
Yeah, because they had these people who would go from place to place and down, yeah, you're doing it wrong.
Were they expected to go on a pilgrimage to the temple or
Not that I'm
the
aware of, no.
central place?
No. Mm-mm.
Not that I know of.
The size of the assemblies, the placement of the altar, the seats, the pulpits, and where the door was were all similar once they began to start building churches. We also have written sources. There's the Bible, the liturgical readings, the first testimonies of Christian celebrations are here. And there's a whole lot in Revelation if you can dig through it and find it. And then there are the church orders, which we will talk about a lot in session 3, the organization of Christian communities. And there's a document called the Didache. I think you say it Didache. Is it
Didache?
Didache. And there's just a wealth of information there. And then there are commentaries on the rituals by Tertullian, Ambrose, John Chrysostom. Can't say his name. Yeah. Augustine, Cyprian, and Agarian. And I learned a lot from Origen when I was in grad school. So there were people who were writing things down. I had some questions. There is that element of confession in the Catholic Church. What about confession?
We have it every Sunday,
I like that though.
but not
Good.
personally.
We don't have to go into a private little room that has a shadowy curtain.
We do it corporately instead of privately and personally.
And we don't have to pay penance, except to ourselves.
I grew up Baptist and we didn't have any confession.
That's right. I think it's really a good addition. I think some being here.
Well, I'm not sure the Catholic Church would have survived monetarily without confession, especially in the Dark Ages, because that's how they got their money.
Yeah, tell me something about the communion. How widespread is what we do, open to everybody? Is that what, I know the Episcopal Church does here. They say it's open to everybody, no question. But we've been in Catholic churches for weddings and funerals and it's just, they were told, this, you do not participate.
Right.
And you better not. But in one, I think the funeral we went to for our son's father-in-law, he said you could come up and kneel, but not.
You just had to cross your arms. Yeah.
Yeah, and but in the Dominican Republic, they encouraged us to come down and say, don't worry about all this stuff. Just come on down and take it.
In a Catholic church?
Yes, Catholic church, only Catholic church.
Interesting.
I'm sure
And
there
their
was.
churches were packed.
We had one church we went to, had a Polish priest, and he was there, and he gave about 4 or 5 sermons every Sunday morning. I mean, just as soon as you got one out, the crowd would be waiting to take the seats. They'd leave, another crowd come in. Wow. This was in Santo Domingo. But it wasn't the only Catholic church in that. There's been 50 Catholic churches.
Wow.
It varies from denomination to denomination. Like the disciples of Christ, communion is open to everyone. And I have friends who were disciples because of that they were welcome there where they weren't welcome in their own church. Some of them, you have to be a member of the church. I've been to Primitive Baptists when they do their annual communion, and you're not supposed to take it unless you are a member of
That church.
Well, not even that church. Well, usually they're meeting in
Oh,
groups
okay.
because they move around. But if you're not a Primitive Baptist, you're not supposed to take it. So there's a huge amount of variety, and I think there's some loosening going on now. Because a lot of churches are being a little more open to who they allow. I think they're a little less restrictive. That's just sort of my gut feeling about what I've seen.
I was in a former Presbyterian church where the minister declared if you had not been baptized, you could not take communion. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's standard practice for Presbyterians. I hope not.
Well, I have one final thing to say about the first century Eucharist, and then I'm done. In the first century, the Eucharist was presented not by one priest, but by many priests. And so they had named several priests in each community, and there were several of them who gave the Eucharist on Sunday morning.
So in one service, multiple priests might preside.
Yes. And they were also facing the people and not facing the back of the church. Now, I don't know if you've been in a Catholic church, but the priest will face the back of the sanctuary, not the people.
The altar.
Yeah, faces the altar. And interactive worship was a moral obligation for the priest in the early church. So the Catholics got it wrong. Oh, sorry.
God forgives. Thank goodness.
Wasn't Jan Hus the first person to offer basically the cup to the people? So because in Cali you just get the bread and not the wine, but he started offering the wine and got him burned at the stake, but under safe passage. Come here, we'll talk about it. Heretic.
Because
Hussites.
the priests only could take the cup.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I've presented you with a lot of information and not in a real standard form, sort of a, and so do you have any questions?
We did only cover, I think, the first stage of liturgical development.
First
Okay.
century.
Okay, okay.
Apostolic, yeah.
Thanks.
We haven't talked about hymns, but I think hymns have always been a part of worship, even back among the Jewish people, because I think some of the Psalms are hymns.
Yes.
And they were written to be sung and certainly are appropriate for worship, and we use them still in worship. And sometimes we speak them and sometimes we sing them. And I think the New Testament even has some first century hymns, and they may have been used in worship. And one that I've heard might have been used in worship is the prologue to John. That beautiful prologue to John might have originally been a hymn and used in worship.
Interesting. Let's see.
Well, we had an interesting anthem this Sunday morning in church, I thought. Well, I first was confronted with those words after I graduated from Tech. I spent a year studying Albert Schweitzer book, The Quest of the Historical Jesus. And near the end, I was frustrated because I felt like I knew less than I'd started with. And then I had this last paragraph, which I have read many, many times and showed it to my children to read, my wife. And that was the words of that hymn this morning, Sunday morning.
Which hymn was it?
He comes to us.
Oh, he comes to us. That's what the choir sang.
Yeah.
That's it, yeah, it's special. You know, it's to me, it was for a guy like Schweitzer who had written this tome of what the most learned Christian theologians knew and what believed about Jesus. He came down to this one last statement, and it really was the whole answer.
And it was,
He comes to us.
he comes,
Comes to us as one unknown,
That
as
was
the king of the
Sturgeon?
fishermen by the lakeside. It's
Did you say
a powerful
Sturgeon?
statement.
You say
And
Sturgeon?
then we have to follow, we have to answer in our own way.
Sturgeon, is that the theologian? I couldn't understand.
Schweitzer.
no, Schweitzer.
Schweitzer.
Oh, Schweitzer, okay.
Especially,
I was gonna say that's a fish.
No, there's
Like
an
a
old
sturgeon.
There's Spurgeon, we're not Methodist.
Well, this coming Sunday, we're still going to be talking and singing about Jesus coming to the lake shore and
Oh, I love
calling disciples and them dropping their nets and leaving their boats and following him.
and it's interesting to me that Schweitzer, after writing that, took off for Africa and came to his life to be a medical missionary. And he had trouble doing it because the church, there were people in church who didn't think he was Christian,
Yeah.
and his teachings were heresy and had no business being in church, let alone without being a spokesman for church. So he had a tough time.
I was fascinated with Albert Schweitzer when I was a child.
You what?
I was fascinated with
Oh, me.
him when I was a child.
Oh, me too. Me too. I read several books. That's why I had to read that final one. He is more of his autobiography is kind of like out of my life and thoughts. And I found it to be very good.
Yeah. I read the library had biographies and they were all orange. The books. I guess they had.
All the biographies were
Yeah,
orange?
orange. They were all
They
orange.
used one
And they had
printer.
like a silhouette
On the front, yeah. And I read every one of them, and one of them was about Albert Schweitzer. And I read it like 3 times. I loved it.
I read Jane Eyre 3 times. I don't think that's comparable.
I read Gone with the Wind 3 times.
Wow.
What's it called?
Gone with the Wind.
Gone with the wind.
I read it 3 times.
So I do invite conversation. I love input, so I hope you all like that.
Definitely.
Good. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you for teaching us.